I just wanted to make a couple of things about this film, because there's relatively little film footage of Northern Ireland during the Second World War compared with GB, when they were producing vast amounts of propaganda films and films with the home front. But Northern Ireland, as I say, there is very little actually produced, and reads that are quite interesting, and if anybody wants to research that, those of you who are looking for a subject, some quite interesting files in here about the attempts of the Northern Ireland government to get some propaganda out and why it didn't happen. This is one of the few films made, sorry, the Ulster Home Guard. It was actually produced towards the end of 1944 by the Army Cinema Service at the request of the Inspector General of the RUC, who had the overall responsibility, as we heard, for the Ulster Home Guard. The Army Cinema Service was the organisation that made propaganda and training films for the Army. Not a very sophisticated outfit. They made this for free, which was a very important consideration for the Northern Ireland government, it has to be said. And, when it was made, when the Inspector General didn't say it was very good, but it lacked technical refinements, he then suggested handing it over to the Northern Ireland Government Information Service for them to spend a bit more money on to try and upgrade, and then to use it for propaganda purposes, which was what was done. And there was various things that had to be done to the original film. Adding music soundtrack, which you'll hear on this, adding some stock footage, re-editing some sort of technical things about getting smooth fades and transformations between one scene and the other. They also added bits and pieces. Now we don't know exactly what adds. They certainly added the bit at the end where you see the Ulster contingent taking part in the Home Guard parade in London in 1945. You also, I think, did a bit at the start where they put in some stock footage of Northern Ireland Giant's Causeway and put in a bit which gives the film a political slant, which I won't go into because it's not exactly a subtle political slant, you'll be able to work it out for yourselves. But so that was the way the film had been taken from originally being just a short, straightforward commemoration of the Home Guard into a sort of political vehicle. The Northern Ireland government did then try and use it for propaganda. They're very keen to get it out into GB and into the Commonwealth, into Australia and Canada. And there's note in the file that they did, towards the end of 1945, get the ABC cinema chain in GB to actually take the film for a few months. So it did get out to a fairly wider cinema audience. But the majority of what you're going to see in the film was what is shot by the Army Cinema Service. It's using Home Guards themselves, no paid actors. I'll leave you to try and work out where it's filmed. As an interesting guessing game and working out where this was filmed. The only sort of figure I can very recognisable is John Andrews, the former Prime Minister, who makes an appearance rephrasing his role, swearing in the men of the Home Guard at the start of the war in a reconstruction, which I suspect is not that authentic to what actually happened. And as I say, after that, your guess is as good as mine as where it's actually filmed. Some of the areas are quite recognisable, some aren't. So with that, we'll actually start into it.
This film is the story of the Ulster Home Guard and the part they played in the defence of Great Britain. By 1940, Northern Ireland had been the last remaining lifeline from Great Britain to the outside world. The possession of this base by enemy or neutral would have spelt defeat. This is the country where these men live. This is the land they were resolved to defend against any attack the Germans might make. They were part of the Ulster war effort, which gained this tribute from Mr. Churchill. German plans and preparations were complete. Every effort to prevent war had failed, and the British Commonwealth of Nations, peace-loving and unprepared, were defending freedom against the most formidable aggressor the world had ever seen. By 1940, the German victories in northern France had brought their armies to the very frontiers of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and only these islands stood between them and world domination. Relocation called for local defence volunteers to supplement the regular forces, and in every city, town and village, the response was immediate. Thousands of men from every walk of life. After each party had been sworn in, a rifle and 100 rounds of ammunition were issued to each man, and training, etc., began immediately. Soon these men were on the range, learning to use their rifles to the best effect. Factories are important to provide against saboteurs. Home guards employed in the factories were organized for this duty, and at the end of each day's work manned their posts and guarded their factory until the next day's work began. Another operational task assigned to the Ulster Home Guard was a check on all traffic. Roadblocks were manned and identity cards checked. A watch for parachute troops was ordered and outposts. In many cases, shelter had to be improvised. Sentries kept watch from dusk till dawn. At this time, a form of black denim uniform had been issued to the force. Greatcoats were not yet available, but thousands of ground sheets were purchased and issued. The Ulster Home Guard were fortunate, not only in having a rifle for each man, but also in the number of Lewis guns. Each company had at least two, and companies allotted to aerodrome defense and other important roles had many more. A number of military officers and NCOs were allotted to assist with training. Charges were issued and training carried out. By this time, supplies of battle dress had become available and were issued to all Home Guards. Every officer and man in the book grenade. The most powerful weapon in general use was the spigot mortar. This weapon had two outstanding characteristics. It was easy to learn and in the hand. It was especially effective in its anti-personnel role. When proficiency had been reached in each weapon, field firing was carried out. The direct weapons were combined, and practice with live ammunition was carried out in a tactical setting. Efficient and keen on the signal. As far part of the long-range intercommunication scheme of Northern Ireland, an extensive and complete pigeon service was established and proved its value on many signal exercises. Demand for manpower resulted in a request for Home Guards to undertake a considerable part of the Ack defence of Dublin Island. A large number of Ulster Home Guard were allotted to the Ack defence of Belfast and Londonderry. Intensive training under Ack instructors. Later, live practice with towed targets brought them to the required standard. They slept on the gun sites, ready to defend their city, which already wore the scars of enemy attack. Their special prize was the Ack style, the black bow and arrow on a red ground, which they were now entitled to wear. Armaments for the defense of guns included 75mm and 25-pounder field guns. A large number of these were manned by Ulster Home Guards. Training was intensive, and in light on the anti-tank ranges, a very high degree of accuracy was reached. Every weekend, meals had to be provided for Home Guards who in Ireland, the WVS, were always of the greatest assistance when called upon. Victories in Europe had been the swift and deep penetration of mechanized columns. The Ulster Home Guard were determined that this would not happen here. Suitable ambush sites were chosen, organized and tested with tactical exercises. In many of these exercises, the regular army provided the enemy. Much experience was gained and many useful lessons were learned in this way. Waiting for him every few miles, his progress in Northern Ireland will be slow and painful. 1940 had become the Ulster Home Guard of 1944, and were able to undertake the defense of their country against any counterstroke the Germans might make. The victories in northern France, Belgium and Holland removed the probability of it, and it was decided that the Home Guard would stand down and go into reserve on the 3rd of December 1944. On this date, ceremonial parades were held and ended in Belfast. The troops were addressed by the commander, Belfast Sub-District. Later, the salute was taken by the Governor of Northern Ireland. In preparation for the stand-down parade in London, men from every battalion were assembled in Victoria Barracks, and from the contingent of 3 which took their place among Home Guard contingents from all over Great Britain at the march past in Hyde Park, where the salute was taken by His Majesty the King.
The praises of which were being sung there is most famous for almost killing General de Gaulle in its first trial when it's shown to various politicians and great dignitaries, and the whole lot apparently blows up in a way that almost catches him in the glass. So the fact that they couldn't even get it to hit anything in a propaganda film is a pretty good reflection of how useless that was. On with the programme now, we turn to Ian Montgomery, a man who probably needs no introduction to many of us, well known as a senior archivist here at PRONI and responsible for, amongst other things, their military collections, and it's largely him with the thank for today's conference for putting the programme together and inviting us here. A number of publications to his name, most recently articles in the Irish Sword, which I'm sure a number of us have read with interest. And I'm also conscious that many in the audience today are from the Ulster Aviation Society, so this paper will be of particular interest to you about short and Harland in Northern Ireland and photographic records. So Ian, we're very much looking forward to hearing what you have to say.
Right, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Me again. What I'm going to do in this particular section is just to give you a sort of short overview of one of what I think is one of the more interesting collections that we've acquired in recent years, which is the photographic collection of what was Short Brothers in Harland, then Short Brothers, and is now part of Bombardier Aerospace, particularly focusing on the war years. We don't have a great deal in the way of an actual paper archive, but there is this wonderful collection of about 100,000 photographs, which record all aspects of the company's work up until fairly recent times. And I think it does give you an interesting picture of what was going on in this particular company. I won't be saying very much about what it did during work, because I know Phil Ollerenshaw will be dealing with short during his presentation, and does go and deals with the company in the book. Quick bit of background. Short and Harland is created as an aircraft manufacturer in 1908, formed by the three Short brothers who had been involved in the various engineering projects during the end of the 19th century, start of the 20th century. And they got involved, among other things, in the production of air balloons, or sorry, gas balloons. This has got them into contact with the Aero Club, the Society of very upper class aviation enthusiasts in London. From working on balloons, they move on to working gliders. Then, when powered flight comes in, they are the first company to team up with the Short brothers, or sorry, with the Wright brothers. And this is a very famous photograph. The Short brothers, the Wright brothers, and quite a number of other leading lights in the history of British aviation, including Moore Brabazon and Charles Rolls, and Frank McLean. Charles Rolls, of Rolls-Royce, an early aviator who was actually killed flying on Short's airplanes, interestingly enough. You know, they're involved right at the beginning of aviation in Britain. During the First World War, they built a lot of aircraft, mainly for the Navy. That's one of the early short biplanes. In 1908 they get a contract to make the Wright brothers design under contract, and so they are probably the first manufacturer, first company actually manufacturing airplanes on any scale in the world. To say, during the First World War they do various stuff, mainly for the Navy, but they do occasional things like the short bomber. Post-war, like all companies have to diversify and try and survive, they do end up specialising mainly in flying boats, seaplanes, including things for the Royal Air Force, like the short Singapores, which is the mainstay of main flying boat for the RAF in the interwar years. They're probably best known for doing these large Empire flying boats that became known. These were developed in the late 30s by what was Imperial Airways to provide a service outfit to the Empire, to India, to Africa, using flying boats because normally aircraft had to range to make the flight in one go, so the flying boat could do it in sections over 3 or 4 days and in some style. These big C-class, and that is one of the later G-class boats, I think, was made towards the end. 39 are sort of the main overseas aircraft for the British, and it is very luxurious flying. This is not Ryanair. So this is Hawaiian style. So that's what they're famous for. Why do they end up in Belfast? Which is quite an interesting question, and I'm still not altogether sure what the answer is. There's a number of factors at play here. I did find some interesting stuff in our files from Lord Rothermere. Rothermere is the newspaper buyer, Daily Mail, but very involved in politics, on the right, very much on the right in politics, but like a lot of right-wing politicians, he doesn't see any contradiction between rapprochement with Hitler, making friends with Hitler to a certain extent, but also keeping strong defences, and particularly strong air defences. So, for instance, a letter for him to 1934 to another person of a similar viewpoint, the Marquess of Londonderry, who was Secretary of State for Air, which is copied in the Northern Ireland file, in which he bases the point he's concerned that he's received a number of letters, he says, which is dubious, but anyway. And he mentions that in aerial warfare, one of the immediate objectives will be the aircraft factories of the enemy. It's a matter of much concern that not one of those, even those in Derby and Bristol, is outside the range of a bombing machine of moderate performance coming from Germany. He means he doesn't actually say that. And therefore wish to press your attention to the need of having aircraft factories in Northern Ireland. Londonderry is an exceptionally soon to become the centre for the aircraft manufacturing industry. The waters of Lough Foyle will be immensely useful for the trial and test of airplanes. And this is a little taken in. I suppose someday your department will get a move on to remove our dangerous disparity in the air. And when that day arrives, I hope the question of location of further factories will matter of primary consideration. And the sting in the end, our air correspondence in the Daily Mail today emphasises this situation. So Rothermere does start a campaign through his papers about moving aircraft factories away from the east of England. And there's another letter beside it is from one of the correspondents of the Daily Mail to the Secretary of the Northern Ireland Cabinet saying he's going to come over to Northern Ireland, take a tour around and write articles in the paper. And there indeed is one of the articles in the paper, in Daily Mail, one of a series, which maps out very neatly where all the British aircraft industry is located. It's all on the east side of the country, and it's all within range of German bombers. And shorts are there. East as you get in Rochester. So that's making a fairly blunt case. This is followed up to a certain extent by Northern Ireland government. The Ulster Industry Development Association sends this letter in 1935 round to all the aircraft manufacturers saying you're very vulnerable to attack by somebody. They never actually says Germany, but by somebody. And you probably want to relocate your factory, and you just think about Northern Ireland. And he's pushing both Belfast and Derry. And cited there's an interesting paper which the Northern Ireland government had written saying that the future of aviation, transatlantic aviation, is flying boats, and flying boats will operate in the sort of large area of water, and Lough Foyle and Lough Neagh would be two very good indications of the flying boat base. So there's this going on, there's this idea of promoting companies come over. There are other factors going on here as well. The Belfast Harbour Commissioners, God bless them, they decide to develop the airport, what's now Belfast City, George Belfast City Airport, as the main airport for Belfast. Up to that stage, Lord Londonderry were trying to persuade them to use ours as the main airfield. But they start to develop unreclaimed land. They're based there, both as for a civilian hub for Belfast and also as a possible station for the RAF. So that's going on, so that there's an airfield being built down the reclaimed land down in Shorts. There's all this concern about moving the industry away from the east of England. There's a certain amount of grants being available through the New Industry Development Act in Northern Ireland, which will give some financial assistance to any company that wants to relocate. And also there's a campaign in Britain to persuade aircraft manufacturers to go into partnership with shipbuilders, so to get a sort of cross-fertilisation of skills. So there's all those things going on, and out of that sort of menage of ideas, we end up Shorts moving to Northern Ireland, as they do in 1936. Moving down to this area, just up the road, in fact, but they still are today, and using the airport for all the aircraft and building them down here. Also have the deep water the dock so they can build flying boats, though I'm not altogether sure whether building flying boats was ever actually part of the original plan, interestingly enough. So there's the building going up, 1936. It's still there today, still looks very much the same. A very nice example of 1930s industrial architecture. They haven't done very much to the building, at least not to the main building. So it is still there, and it still bears the scars of the 1941 bombing we'll come to in a minute. They come here to build originally a strange looking plane. Some of you will recognise that and some of you won't. The Bristol Bombay Transport and Bomber. This was actually a plane which was developed by the Bristol Aircraft Company. They then moved over to building Brennan's instead, which seemed like a good idea, and Shorts got a subcontract to build these, and they assembled them in Belfast. It is not one of the sort of starry aircraft of the Second World War by any means. You can probably see the back there looking at it, and the contract was actually sort of reduced. Originally going to build 100 of these, and I think it was 50 built. It's mainly flies in the Far East. You can tell what the RAF thought of an aircraft by how far east it ends up operating. This ended up operating in Iraq. It probably tells you all you need to know about it. Really, not a great success, but it does start the shipbuilding. It does start the aircraft building in Northern Ireland. They also get a contract for Hanley Page Hereford, which is another one you probably haven't heard of, which was a variant of the Hanley Page Hampton, which again you may not have heard of, which was one of the earlier attempts at a light bomber. So again, not a great success. The Hereford was a bit of a disaster, and they had to do a lot of work to get it work again. Again, that's a subcontract by Shorts from Hanley Page. So not particularly a special start in terms of aircraft, but they do build up a workforce of 6,000 in 1938, which considering the unemployment rates in Belfast is quite significant. So this is the only major gain that Belfast gets from the rearmament programme in the UK. But the main work during the war is to be two iconic aircraft, the Stirlings and the Sunderlands, which end up being built in Belfast. Again, I'm not altogether sure whether the original intention was to do these aircraft in Belfast. The Shorts factory, the Shorts continued to be in Rochester and had factories in London. And as Lord Rothermere had predicted, the Germans in 1940, particularly the daylight rage on London, they do a lot of damage to Shorts factories in London, which is another factors for encouraging production to move over to Northern Ireland. And as Brian pointed out earlier, his thinking right up until 1940 was that Northern Ireland would be beyond the reach of any aircraft flying from Germany. They didn't anticipate aircraft flying from France, or indeed the fact that the Germans would be able to hit Belfast at night. So Stirling production then moves across largely to Northern Ireland. They still build them in England, various places, but the development of the plane takes place to a large extent in Northern Ireland. The Stirling was the first 4-engine heavy bomber that the RAF produced. It was a problematic plane, produced I think in 1936 specification. It's the first 4-engine bomber to go into service with the RAF in 1941, I think it goes into squadron service, but a lot of problems with the development of the airplane, and it's actually taken out of Bomber Command First Line service in 1943. The Bomber Command then fairly due to concentrate on the Halifax and the Lancaster. The Sterling never had the height, never had the forms, never could make the heights of the Halifax and the Lancaster, never had the large capacity bomb boats. So it wasn't a great success, but it was the first four-engine bomber produced, and it allows the British to go on the offensive, to actually attack Germany. This is Bomber Command's main role, to go on the offensive, and the Sterling is what makes that possible to a large extent. So that was the first one being loaded. This is one of my favourite photographs. This is the first couple of Sterlings at the Harbour Airport in 1940. You can see the old and new. You can see one of the Hamptons just underneath the wing at the back. You can see also a Aberranson in the background as well from, I have notes about this, I think it's 46 Squadron operating out of Liverpool, which must have landed at the Harbour Airport to refuel or something. So you can see the past and the future of the RAF very neatly in that photograph. So Sterling production takes off in Belfast with after some initial teething problems. I'll just give you some rather nice photographs of the Sterling. It's quite round about one of the Sterling over the shipyard. And as I should say, Shorts were always very good at recording and photographing and keeping a record of what they did. And so there's usually these very nice images. So we still have. And there's the later Mark V. To say, although Bomber Command sort of moved away from it by 43, the Sterling is still produced for a variety of other things, including mine laying, coastal command, get a few. It also becomes a Tiger, a glider tug, and usually paratroopers. So there's quite a lot of Sterlings involved on D-Day with the airborne landings and with Operation Market Garden. So these are the later variants of the Sterlings without gun turrets being used for that sort of a role. And there's the 1000 Sterling at Montgomery. As mentioned earlier on Mackey's got a subcontract to build a lot of these. There were a lot of problems with Short's performance during the war, and people were unhappy they weren't doing all they might, so a lot of work was subcontracted out, and Mackey's got the build, did the final assembly and quite a lot of stuff. And in fact, over at Aldergrove, I'm not sure whether that photograph taken from the Aldergrove, but that's the 1000 Sterling. Sorry, it was taken at McGarry. I should actually read my own captions sometime. So it's taken at McGarry, but that's the 1000 allegedly anyway, being rolled out. Also a nice shot of it in High Street, Belfast 1943. We heard about the Blitz. The Blitz does a lot of damage in Belfast, a lot of cleared sites. So they set up in 1943 for a fundraising exercise. They brought a Sterling and a Lancaster down to one of the actual bombed sites and put them up there on display for people to see. How on earth they managed to get them down there through the streets, I do not know, but they managed it. And this was to collect money. And interesting enough, you can't see in that, but there's a notice board there which gives you the details of the aircraft, including a list of the cities in Germany that are bombed. So there's no ambiguity about the bombing campaign at this stage. This is a list of all the German cities that are actually hit with this plane. So you can see, it's a very important plane for Belfast, and that's a very evocative and quite often used image. Winston Churchill watching the Sterling take off. This is to say the importance of the Sterling was the first chance for the British to hit back at the Germans by the bombing, using these large bombers to hit Germany, and there's Churchill watching one taking off at dusk on one of the raids. Right, the other important aircraft built here is the Sunderland. The Sunderland is actually a development of those big flying boats which I showed you earlier. And in fact, the Sterling to a certain extent is development of the flying boat because they use quite a lot of fuselage and wings from the Empire flying boats as well. But the Sunderland is a military version of the Empire flying boats developed for the RAF. Again, it becomes a very important aircraft because it is used by Coastal Command on anti-submarine duties. The final variations of it have a very long range. Some of the later variants of it could keep in the air for 14 hours, but they double cruise. They could do very long patrols out over the Atlantic, and it could be used to attack submarines with death charges. So they become very important in the Atlantic War. As you know, flying from Banana. So a nice photograph of them under construction on a large scale. These are built in large numbers in Belfast and around Northern Ireland. And you can see, so production line. There's another view up there. So you see, it's a very big operation building these aircraft. And I know some people like these types of photographs, so I'll put a few of them in. There's a little cockpit of the Sunderland. The controls on it. Some more shots which I know will get some people interested, and not others. Just some shots of the interior. These are record photographs, should make that point. They're not just made for propaganda, they're made as a record for the engineers, just, where everything is. And there's a lot of very technical stuff showing jigs, the actual machines and lathes used to make the aircraft. Those are all carefully photographed as a record so they know what they've done. Oh yeah, another one of the interior or something. And there's a nice one, something going wrong. That's a Sunderland going ground at Grace Point Fort, just down the loch. So it wasn't always 37. If you know that particular point at Grace Point, quite a lot of boats actually go around there. People assume that the deep water comes all the way in, but there are rocks there. So I've seen a few things go around there, but nothing that spectacular. Something else which actually moves down beside Shorts is the Civilian Repair Organisation. This is an organisation set up by the Air Ministry to do repairs in aircraft the RAF couldn't handle. It's managed by a civilian organisation, so they have a factory down beside Shorts and they are doing repair work. The main benefit of that for us is to get a lovely set of photographs of all the aircraft, all the Allied aircraft of the First World War. Those are all lovely recording of there. So there's a Mark I Hurricane film from 1941, which was repaired in the CRO with all the details on it. So it's a very interesting photographs of an interesting aircraft. There's a Gloucester Gladiator from 1942. Why on earth they were repairing Gloucester Gladiators in 1942, I do not know. This thing would have been obsolete from 1938. But they were still being faithfully repaired for some reason. And there's another aircraft of some wonderfully average aircraft. Happens to be for an Blenheim in 1943. All of these more or less obsolete by this stage, but still being repaired by the Civilian Repair Organisation. So by 1941 you have a very large organisation down in the Harbour Estate. You have Harland and Wolf going full blast, making aircraft. You've got Shorts, who are now called Short and Harland, and was the partnership with the shipyard, also turning out aircraft in large numbers. So there's a lot going on down there. And as Brian has pointed out, this has not escaped the attention of the Luftwaffe, who had the area pretty well covered. So they knew exactly what was down there, and that's a very, very inviting target. An aircraft factory and a major shipyard sitting right together. So that is a very irresistible target. And so as we referred, they do come over. Now, Shorts did make preparations. So some nice photographs. Shorts have their own ARP unit, which is much better equipped and organised than the other ones in the city because Shorts put up the money for them. So they have their own trader pumps and quite a lot of other equipment in the early days, and are quite well trained. So there is preparations being made. They knew that's going to be the target area, and there's a lot of effort goes in. They also have a big program of building shelters down there. So you probably have more shelters in the harbour than the rest of the city. And have a home guard unit. I've probably not taken 1941, I'm going to caption probably there, but there is a short-term home guard unit as well. Anyway, as we know, Luftwaffe came over in 1941 and they did an awful lot of damage to Shorts factory. That's just an example. These are the record photographs taken immediately after by Shorts. There's a very large number of these because it was done for insurance purposes basically, so I did get compensation, so they took all the damage. So you can see it burnt out sterling there, more or less burnt out. There's one there completely wrecked. Another one, so you can see the extent of the damage, very badly damaged. This put back production of the sterling very badly. It did a lot of damage to the sterling program. The answer to this, once this had happened, was dispersal. Because of the concentration, that was the target, so the answer is then disperse all this production out from Belfast as far widely as possible into other sites. So Shorts immediately start looking for other centres, start making things. They go down to Balmoral to the King's Hall, Balmoral Dispersal Unit. If you know the King's Hall, behind it there's the Ulster Agricultural Showgrounds. There's a lot of ground out there, and there's a lot of room for actually doing this sort of thing. So they take over that area. There's, I've never worked out whether these are Sunderlands or Stirling. I think they're Stirlings. Fuselage is being built inside the King's Hall. And that's the King's Hall, the statue at the back. As you see, it's been turned into a factory for production of fuselages. There's quite a lot of photographs showing this. Quite a lot of photographs showing the camouflage with around it as well. And there's a lot of photographs showing these. This is one of my favourite ones. If you have factories and stores around Lisburn, if you can spot what the factory or the store is, you're good. I haven't a clue where they were in Lisburn. I know they were in Lambeg. We took over in middle Lambeg, but there's lots of photographs, recording various places they went to. So somewhere in that photograph, somebody's making airplanes in 1945. Anybody knows Lisburn? And they were also at the maze, in the building now used by the Ulster Relocation Society, also doing final assemblies on, I think that's Stirling's again, down there, where they have the airfield as well to actually fly them off from. The problems of this sort of production, you don't have to be a time, there's also quite a lot of small units, which are also faithfully recording these photographs. So Stanley Motor Workshop in Orangefield, just a small garage they took over as a store. There's an interior shop, complete with a very nice poster of Stalin. They were having labour problems in the 1940s, but maybe explain a lot. But those are the days when Stalin was on our side, so that was all right. So they have a lot of these units scattered around the place. So you don't have to be a tender motion expert to realise that this type of reduction doesn't come without its problems. So this is them trying to get the problems of actually getting a fuselage down, probably taking it down to McGarbury for final assembly from the King's Hall, through the winding narrow roads down there. So you do wonder if this was ever an effective way of making aircraft. These problems getting these down. There's a nice series of these. There's another one there. But having to strengthen bridges, taking down telephone wires every time they had to take it past. So it was a bit of an operation. Right, very large workforce being built up. By 1944, the workforce is in somewhere in the well over 30,000 in shorts and subcontractors. It's nearly double at one stage the number working in the shipyard. So it's a very, very big operation in Northern Ireland. A lot of people employed in it. So just these photographs just give you some idea of sort of crowd of people. That's Harry Midgley, 1941. I think it's before I think it's just after he joined the government, and what Wills was doing his bid for savings and encouraged people to work. And there's in theory, there's like all these wartime companies, a big emphasis on welfare of the workers, feeding the workers properly, giving them film shows, all the rest of it. So this is the works canteen in full blast in 1941. Again, just gives you an idea just the scale of the operation. One of the other factors is with the rapid expansion, you have to bring in workforce from where you can get them. So I always use this with school groups. See if you can spot the difference between this photograph and the next one. You have all these women appearing. Now, not just to do clerical work. Of course, this was being one of the contentious issues, was to bring women into what would traditionally be in the areas in engineering. I mean, obviously, women had always been involved in clerical work to some extent, but you're getting women into other in manufacturing. So the Glen works in Newton Ards, which Bombardier still have. So you get a lot of women working there and various things. I think these are making external fuel tanks for various aircraft. Somebody will correct you later. And this is Lambeg. There's quite a nice series of photographs of these women working on, including one inspector. There's also photographs showing these women being taken up for a flight round in Stirling later. So they're obviously emphasising, they're bringing women into these types of jobs to free up men for fighting like the other companies. There's a lot of photographs in here that actually record that. Towards the end of the war, the thinking into the future, there's an attempt even before the war ends to move back towards civilian production. They tried to convert the Stirling into a passenger aircraft with the exciting name of the Silver Stirling, I think Avro tried the same trick with the Lancaster bombing, relabeling it the York. But actually people with found civilians weren't prepared to travel long distances in a converted bomber, so I don't think the Sterling airliner actually worked. They did have more success in re-civilianising the flying boats, so even before the end of the war, the flying boats, some of the flying boats continued to fly during the war with BYC, because the civilian air system, the passenger system does keep going. And towards the end of the war, they're reconverting some of the military flying boats as civilian aircraft, and after the war, Shorts continued to try and make flying boats. And up until I think 1951, particularly for the Australian market, they were seen as still being a viable option. So that's the Solent, which has been the last of the ones based on those earlier C-class boats in operation. And it's not until actually some of these actually were still flying in the 1970s, and some of them were remote parts of the Pacific Island. But by the 1950s, we recognised the flying boat was no longer a viable system. And just to see, again, they're going back to actually promoting the flying boats as luxury travel. Again, this is the way to travel on an airplane. You've got bunks, you've got a bar, the tables, you know. So that is about it. That is just to give you a flavour of what is in this collection, which is available now. And it's a remarkable record, not just for the war years, it goes up into recent times, but it's a remarkable record of the company, what the company is doing. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Ian. Very interesting paper, and obviously very important photographic collection here at PRONI. I sat through it looking with keen interest because one of my grandfathers worked for Shorts, and I thought he maybe popped up somewhere there. I didn't notice it immediately, but probably something to explore another day. We turn now to Dr. Philip Ollerenshaw, who's with us today, and with us, as many academics are when they travel around the country to sell his new book to us. Book launch is at 5 o'clock, hopefully with books. Book launches without books are a lot more difficult, but his book has just been published by Manchester University Press, and it's on the topic that he'll be speaking to us this afternoon. Philip Ollerenshaw has done a lot of work on economic history. I think the earliest work was in banking in Ireland, which should have been compulsory reading for any number of politicians, but unfortunately wasn't, as events went on to prove. And then it's contributed to a number of important, particularly Eldon collections, economic history of Ulster, and more recently Ulster since 1600. He's made very important and valuable contributions to those. And the book then on politics, economic mobilisation society, I'm sure will find a ready market, even if the price is now nudged up to the top end of the academic levels, which unfortunately we all endure. But an interesting wide-ranging paper, I'm sure, is in store for us. So Philip,
thank you very much, Tim, and good afternoon, everybody. Thanks very much for staying until the very last talk of the afternoon, sometimes referred to by academics as the graveyard slot in conferences. Politics, economic mobilisation and society in Northern Ireland is my theme. What I'm going to try and do is say a little bit about writing about the war itself, look at Northern Ireland on the eve of the war, and then move on to the war period and consider some important themes for us. Unemployment and industrial unrest is one, agriculture and rural life is another. Look at the business sector and include 3 case studies. Mackey's, Short and Harland, and Wolfe. And then move on to the politics and look at the interrelationships between the economic history and the political history of this region, by-elections, Commons, the Unionist Party, and so on. And then move on to consider some social problems and policies like policing, crime, housing, and health. So it's saying a small amount about a large number of things. And then at the end, what difference does the war make to this region? Okay. Writing regional wartime history. I think for the economic, social and political historian, the region is a helpful lens through which to see the war. The war can be approached either right from the level of the individual citizen, male or female, right through to grand strategies and intercontinental conflict. The region's quite useful, I think, but even so, it requires some national and international context if it's going to gain meaning. It needs to balance top-down history of political and business leaders with the sort of bottom-up history of ordinary men and women, civilians and service people. What comes across is the importance within the United Kingdom of regions as elements in the war economy. And through the war there are consistently overloaded regions like the northwest of England and the West Midlands, and underemployed regions, of which Northern Ireland was the most serious example. And my aim in the book, and it looks like this, and it has arrived on the tables at the back there, my aim was to build on the pioneering work of authors such as Blake, Brain Barton, we've heard from today, Bew, Gibbon and Patterson, and more recently Gillian McIntosh, Leanne Cornick and Diane Urquhart and others, to offer some new perspectives on the regional wartime experience. Okay, let's look at the eve of war. In the rearmament period, Northern Ireland tries very hard, and it did try hard, no question about this, to get government contracts, but never secured the level of orders, the number of orders, the big orders that it wanted. British regions always get priority from 1935 onwards. And I think partly this is simply a function of the distance of Northern Ireland from decision making in London. The Scots have just the same problem with London. Okay. It's just the further you move away from the decision making in London, the weaker the force becomes. And by the time we get to Northern Ireland and Scotland, it's very weak indeed. I think devolved government's a problem here too. The tradition of not discussing Northern Ireland affairs at Westminster, Northern Ireland affairs were somewhere out there, and they weren't discussed. There's also, I think, psychological, geographical and psychological detachment from the approaching war here. Compare Paris, for example, or coastal towns in Kent, where people are very much aware of the sort of approach of a possible conflict. And all this leads to a lack of urgency here, I think, about the war effort, especially in the early years. A problem too, of course, is Northern Ireland's reputation for communal strife. It gave it a negative reputation in Britain and British government circles, and that works against the award of government contracts. The British government didn't think it was a good idea, for example, to site a new Royal Ordnance factory in West Belfast. It just didn't make sense as far as they were concerned. The 1935 Belfast riots and the subsequent report by the National Council for Civil Liberties on the Special Powers Act was widely reported internationally, not just in North America, but in South Africa and Australia. This is a reminder that Northern Ireland is international news well before the troubles of the 1960s. And I think that's important to remember, because its negative reputation, especially with regard to the riots and the Special Powers Acts and so on, have such broad media coverage. Also damaging to the region was the geographically widespread IRA campaign in Northern Ireland and in Britain, 1939-1940. There were some 160 outrages, as the government called them, between January and June of 1939. Very disruptive to the rail and postal service, power stations, railway lines, and so on. And then, of course, on the 25th of August, just a few days really before war broke out, there was the big bomb in the industrially crucial city of Coventry. Here it is, just outside a branch of Burton's and Broadgate in Coventry on the 25th of August 1939. Caused all sorts of problems for Irish people working in Coventry, trade unions and so on. So that's a real big incident as far as Northern Ireland was concerned. Look at the outbreak of war itself. The strong opposition to conscription here in some quarters showed the limits of consensus on the conflict. There were attacks. Even some unionist leaders feared the consequences of conscription. Sir Basil Brooke, for example, delighted in the end and relieved that conscription wasn't imposed. Much of the British press was not in favour of imposing conscription here either. The outbreak of the war, there are attacks on soldiers. West Belfast, for example, some soldiers relieved of their uniforms, which were then burnt. That was followed by an increase in internment by the government here. There's burning of gas masks in some areas as well on the outbreak of war. The blackout was frequently ignored. Bonfires were often lit in defiance. And it's worth looking at the figures here. The first full year of the war, 1940, there were something like 15,600 convictions for blackout offences. Some 2/3 of them outside Belfast. Farmers, and actually the military too, were big offenders here. There's also, on Christmas Day, starting on Christmas Day 1939, a riot of internees at the jail in Derry. Looking at the war economy, it's characterised by unemployment and a failure to sustain full employment. What you've got in Northern Ireland, of course, as we've heard to some extent, is mainly old firms in traditional industries. Shorts is a big and important exception to that, but they have poor facilities for their workers. Looking ahead, the war economy peaks in 1943 and early 1944, when fears of unemployment, 1930s style, return, especially amongst men. And this is really important for trade unionism here. In Derry and Belfast, said at the time, there were some who fear the end of the war more than its continuance. And at the end of the war, there's more economic uncertainty here than there is in any other region of the United Kingdom. Just looking at the figures, these are 1938 through to 1945. You can see that Great Britain figures for unemployment, 12.6, 9.1, and then they drop almost to nothing. Northern Ireland there, 28.3, 20, 19, 10. Even then, they don't go down to zero. And there's differential in trends between men and women. And what is particularly important is the high levels of employment amongst women in Northern Ireland into 1941. That's largely due to the linen industry, which I'll talk about in a minute. And then towards the end of the war, male unemployment starts to rise, increasing the uncertainty that I mentioned earlier on. Associated with these changes in labour is the change, quite marked change actually, in the industrial relations situation. Before 1939, Northern Ireland was typically less strike-prone than Britain. Between 1940 and 45, Northern Ireland experienced a disproportionately severe level of industrial unrest, especially in aircraft manufacture, engineering and shipbuilding. The 1944 strike here was amongst the worst anywhere in the United Kingdom during the war. So, although it accounted for 2.5% of the insured industrial workforce in the UK, it does account for 10% of the strike. That's quite a remarkable statistic when you consider it in a wartime context. Okay, if we move into the particular sectors and look at agriculture, despite its reputation as an industrial region, of course, agriculture is the biggest single employer and remains so throughout the war. It's generally a success story. Agricultural policy is UK-wide, it's coherent, it's well managed, and here Sir Basil Brooke, given his landed background, his agricultural background, as well as a competent minister, and when he became Prime Minister he looked after it quite carefully as well. The top priority in the war was to increase tillage. That's food production, that's the top priority. Most farmers here, a great majority of farmers, comply, some do not, and were fined as a consequence. What we're reminded of too at the outbreak of war is just how important horses were on the farm. in an age which is used to, high-tech agriculture and agribusiness. In 1939, there were 550 tractors at work on Northern Ireland farms, but there were 75,000 horses. And one important result of the war, as far as agriculture was concerned, is the mechanisation. Not just tractors, but implements as well. So at the end of the war, we've gone from 550 tractors to 7,300. That's an important long-term change for this economy. Drive to increase the output of fruit and vegetables led to the increase in the number of allotments, especially in urban areas. 1,500 allotments in Northern Ireland in 1939, 8,500 by 1944, especially in Belfast. What comes across too is the central importance of the Ulster Farmers' Union as a lobby group and a link with government. Even though it didn't represent a majority of farmers, it was the crucial lobby group for this region. A lot of opposition to Sunday working by farmers. They preferred very much to be 6-day farmers, many of them, rather than, despite the national emergency, many of them held firm to the Sabbath as a Sabbath, and they weren't going to work there. That declines a bit, or a fair bit actually, during the war, but at the outset there's quite a lot of opposition. Agriculture does well during the war, it's quite prosperous, and that helps to narrow the gap in incomes between Northern Ireland and Great Britain. What the war did do, however, was to highlight the problems in rural Northern Ireland. And one example of this is Cooper Foster's BBC programme of January 1945 called Women on the Land in Ulster, which paints a really bleak picture of the social and economic status and political status even of women in rural Northern Ireland. Subservient to husbands and brothers with lives of what she described as endless drudgery. Women were, quote, merely appendages to their menfolk. What this programme did, apart from getting right at the nose of the Ulster Farmers' Union, was to serve to highlight the problems which faced rural women, and it also triggered a rare parliamentary and media debate about the position of rural women during the war. In terms of textiles, linen is one of the most vulnerable of all UK industries in the war because of its dependence on raw materials from Europe. Okay? And by July 1941, unemployment in the industry had reached 37.1%. It's an astonishing figure for wartime, any wartime industry. It had well-established employers' organisation like flax spinners and power loom weavers to negotiate with trade unions and with government as well to share out orders. They did that very well. But there were some major strikes nevertheless, most famously perhaps at Ewarts in 1940, which is all to do with a closed shop and enforcing the closed shop, and that led to the loss of 57,000 working days. So that's a big strike by UK standards. Another interesting development is Littlewood's Barn Mills for the parachute material. Lots of problems there in all sorts of ways, but even so, an important development. Endless reports into linen, endless proposals for solutions, none of them successful. The 1944 report offered no solutions apart from more government aid. There were too many small firms, inefficient marketing, loss of markets, and most importantly, competition from cheaper fabric. And in the long term, the linen trade circular of 1944 summed it up quite nicely. Linen, it said, is the aristocrat of textiles, but these are democratic days. And this is an illustration. This is Doris Blair, the wartime artist, and I'll use half a dozen of these in the course of the talk, and I'm very grateful to the Ulster Museum for letting me use these. Doris Blair captured many aspects of the manufacturing process, women's contribution, men's contribution in the war, Blair's women, if I can call them that, were always clean, purposeful, focused, efficient women, as these are making the parachute material. But this is good illustrations, I think, and we'll come on to something later on. Okay, 3 case studies of firms in Northern Ireland. First up is James Mackey and Sons. Well-established Belfast family firm, incredibly impressive. I don't know why this is, but it would get my vote for the most impressive company anywhere in Northern Ireland during the war. It's versatile, competent, it's reliable, and it's all round impressive, and was seen as such, recognised as such in government circles here and in Britain. 1939 it was employing 1,500 workers, the great majority of whom were men. By 1943 it's got 10,000 workers, 60% of whom were women. That's a massive transformation in this firm. And it was able to expand and be so successful because it utilised unemployed women and underemployed women and premises in the linen industry, in West Belfast and elsewhere. This big reserve of labour on the doorstep, which was able to produce munitions, aircraft components, and so on. So it's an interesting kind of relationship between engineering and textile capacity. I think that one of its secrets is a strong emphasis on workforce welfare. By 1944, I came across an inventory here. It's got a choral society, a dramatic society, it's got clubs for swimming, running, health, beauty, men's and ladies hockey, table tennis, badminton, boxing, football, a dance band and a military band. When did he ever find time to make anything? I don't know, but they did. And I think that's one of their secrets. They just seem to look after their workforce far more than many companies did. Short and Harland, we've heard a lot about today. Very rapid growth in employment. It had new and inexperienced management. I have a great deal of sympathy with the general manager, W.P. Kemp, during the war, because he has to oversee this very rapid expansion. As Ian said, nearly 30,000 workers towards the end of the war, from nothing. There's no established structures, no established procedures. Really, you're starting this from scratch, and that helps to explain all sorts of things about Short and Harland during the war. It has far too few supervisory workers, a lot of time wasted on the shop floor. The post-Blitz dispersal factories, which Ian talked about, led to many more women being employed in aircraft manufacture, because in the new dispersal factories there was no established trade union presence, and the opposition to male trade unionists was a lot weaker in the dispersal factories, hence the ease with which women were employed. As Kemp endlessly reminded the government, which didn't understand, each Stirling aircraft, he says, required 33,000 drawings and 120,000 parts. 78,000 of them made in the works. It's a difficult operation. It takes management skill, labour skills of a very high order, coordination skills of a very high order as well. Much single shift working in Shorts compared to most British aircraft manufacturers, many serious industrial disputes, failure to meet production targets, and in the end, of course, nationalisation in 1943. At the end of the war, a great deal of uncertainty about what was going to happen to this. With Harland and Wolff, unlike Short and Harland, it had been a very big firm for a very long time. It had established practices and procedures. It was a very large firm, but it was also relatively self-contained. It didn't have strong links to the wider regional economy. It was used to doing its stuff on its own. It was quite self-contained. So it has very weak links to subcontractors who complain vociferously about it. It has very difficult wartime relationships with the Admiralty and the British government. The First Lord of the Admiralty, A.V. Alexander, noted in April 1943, the central issue was that production at Harland and Wolff, and I quote, though good in quality, was in fact very poor in quantity. So it's the quantity, not the quality is not the problem, it's the quantity. Why was this? Right, we've got, first of all, transport bottlenecks. As employment increases, transport to and from the yards was very difficult. Workers that were late were locked out and production was lost. They had the highest rates of absenteeism in UK shipbuilding. Okay. Much lost production as a result. They have poor welfare facilities, lack of canteens, for example, for hot meals. They had a rigid pay system, too few chargemen, not enough promotion or pay after promotion for extra responsibilities. They also, and I found this unbelievable when I first read it, they have no personnel department, what we would now call an HR department, which in most organisations is massive, as we all know. But no personnel department for 30,000 workers. Quite a challenge managing that with no personnel department. Both construction and repair work were undertaken in Belfast, but no separate repair department, so workers were constantly going backwards and forwards, losing time and so on. Sir Frederick Reddock, who ran the show, was widely recognised as very able, but he was too concerned with post-Blitz repair work. He was too focused on that, with an eye to being efficient and modern after the war. He didn't keep sufficiently close eye on the firm during the war. Ernest Bevan, Minister of Labour and National Service, of course, and had strong opinions about everything, actually, but he was a very stern critic of Reddock. He was in favour of public ownership, nationalising the yard, it was so bad, but instead the Midland Bank led a move to replace Reddock and install a new chairman, who was an accountant, Charles Palmer of Winnie Smith and Winnie, now part of Ernst & Young. An example of an accountant being brought in using his financial skills to sort out the problems of the yard. Back to Doris Blair, again, I just want to show you five of her illustrations here. This is a good reminder of how high the Stirling was at front. This is the construction of Stirling. Here the Sunderlands, and she was very careful to include men and women in the construction phase of the Sunderland. And here's another one of her purposeful women in munitions. Well, I like this one very much. Very concentrated, very skillful, you know, determined to see the job through to the end. I do like that illustration. And here's another one of very clean, neat, purposeful, focused women, probably at Mackey's, I think possibly at Coombar, but maybe more likely to be Mackey's, engaged in munitions production. And so Blair's great achievement was, of course, to highlight the contribution of women in Northern Ireland during the war. That's another example, very impressive. Okay, moving away from the economy to the sort of bigger picture, if you like, the British press were critical of both ERA and Northern Ireland during the war. They were critical, of course, of ERA's neutrality, but they were also very critical of Northern Ireland's unemployment and large number of industrial disputes, especially in the absence of military conscription. They were critical also of the lack of cooperation, which they couldn't understand, between Northern Ireland and ERA when it came to the issue of joint defence in the face of a threatened or possible invasion, especially after the fall of France in 1940. So there's a lot of criticism of Northern Ireland out there. Here's, they always had it in for De Valera, always, and I don't know whether it's actually true, whether they always rode around on a donkey cart. I suspect it probably didn't. But here it is. This is from the Daily Mail. This is an Illingworth cartoon from the Daily Mail. Strict neutrality, shortcut to Nazi slavery. And he's saying to the donkey, sure, take no notice of it. There's no such place at all. So, Eyre's neutrality, strict neutrality, the donkey doesn't look convinced, by the way, about it. It's a pretty sharp creature, this Wallace and Gromit. The animals are really smart in these cartoons. But this is a good one too. This is the Nazi Express train labelled Invasion, steaming around the tracks. Completely oblivious to the bigger picture is Craigavon here, and De Valera just completely oblivious to it all, and the poor donkey, of course, now has to carry Craigavon, which is no mean feat, as well as De Valera. So that's the way this was seen in the Daily Mail in 1940. Okay, so politically, pressures on the Unionist Party were building already before Craigavon died in the autumn of 1940, partly because of Northern Ireland's limited contribution to the war effort. And I think Craigavon's reputation would have been very much damaged had he been in office during the Belfast Blitz of 1941. Andrews in office damaged Andrews' reputation as it would have been Craigavon's, I think. So John Andrews takes over as Prime Minister in 1940 until 1943, and I quite like this quote of the Manchester Guardian when Andrews takes over from Craigavon. While Mr. Andrews also belongs to the school of the Covenant, there will be nothing mystical in the source from which he derives his authority. There's not been the same magical laying on of hands that there was when Sir Edward Carson blessed Sir James Craig. Northern Ireland passes from the apostolic age to one of more normal politics. Change, however, will be slow. Ulster Unionism is weak in independent thought. That's how it was seen by the Manchester Guardian. And in terms of political pressure, we've got three key by-elections, no general elections, of course, during the war, but in terms of tests of public opinion, by-elections were quite important. North Down, Craigavon's old seat, which the Unionist Party lost to the Independent Unionists, partly because of complacency, partly because of high levels of unemployment. Then there's Willowfield, which, as Graham Walker says, was indisputably the biggest electoral upset since the creation of Northern Ireland, when Harry Midgley won it from the Unionist Party. Unemployment, less of an issue here, but post-Blitz criticism of the government was significant, as was its stale geriatric politics was a bit thin. And after Willowfield, more women and more young people, more young unionists, criticised the government from inside the party, and that, I think, marks the beginning of a real change within the Unionist Party, calling for more progressive social policies. And then there's West Belfast in February 1943, which the Unionist Party lose to anti-partitionist Labour Jack Beattie. Criticism by him of the old gang in government, economic and social policies. Just after the Beveridge report on social policy was published, just a few weeks later, forced migration of workers and so on. And that hastens a political crisis for the Andrews government. Moving on quite sharply then to other themes: policing. Inspector General Sir Charles Wickham determined to protect the quality, as he saw it, of the police. Okay. On the B specials, he argued that their lack of training, education and experience does not make them equal to trained members of the RUC. He's determined to hang on to his force and the quality of his force. That's why he strongly resists the RUC joining the military. He just doesn't want to lose this experience. Okay. And they start to advertise for women recruits in the RUC from spring of 1943, and to join up you have to be either single or widowed, at least 5'4", physically fit, good education, no dependent children, and they must resign on being married or remarried. That was the rule for the new and policy of recruiting women. One of the biggest potential problems that the wartime police faced was the orange parading seasons. And fear of invasion from May of 1940 leads Wickham to demand an end to orange parades because they needed such a big police presence. So shortly after that, the Orange Order agreed to abandon its 12th of July parade, including all county demonstrations, although Orangemen would still meet in the Orange Halls and wear their colours, but no parades. No major Orange parades until 1944, when junior Orangemen of the Belfast area took part in the first wartime parade in the city before going to Carrickfergus. Okay. In Northern Ireland, as elsewhere during the war, lots of worry, angst, moral panics about all sorts of things. One of these things was a steep increase in juvenile crime. Big debate in Northern Ireland about this. It was put down to, the steep increase in crime was put down to lenient and indulgent parents who lived through the First World War and said, oh, I don't want you to have such a sort of strict time during this one, unwilling to discipline their children, overcrowded housing, war psychosis, a whole mental condition about being under blackout and so on, blackout conditions, wartime disruption to households, things like shift working, weekend working, migration, military service, all these things were thought to feed in to the steep rising crime. Increased prevalence of betting as well, and the growing influence of popular pictures, always a candidate there for the decline in moral standards. And one of the age groups which came in for particular comment and examination was the women under 21. And these figures look at the number of prosecutions between 1940 and mid-1944, and the ones in brackets look at the period 1935 to 39. So a big increase in drunkenness, though it doesn't seem that extensive to me, certainly not by current standards. Disorderly conduct, 140 in the war compared to 66. And then the biggest increase of all is offences against public morals, which was widely at the time attributed, at least to some extent, to the US military presence. Soliciting, all these things come into play, and it's really quite important in this area. Theft or other dishonesty did increase in that too. And that leads to a lot of hand-wringing by commentators. Neil Hamish, Derry asked, if the moral price of the blackout was too high, is it actually worth it? You know, if we had kept the lights on, you know, we'd be in a much healthier society. Okay, moving from moral panics to housing and health. I think problems of housing and health affected virtually all rural and urban parts of Northern Ireland. The migration, the big US military presence highlighted housing problems. Rural housing problems were less visible, but probably more serious and more widespread than they were in the towns. If we look at Derry as an example, Derry needed at least 1,000 new houses in 1939. Its population increased by about a quarter during the war because of immigration from surrounding areas, people looking for work. That led to increased subletting and increased overcrowding in already difficult circumstances. In Derry too, there was the problems of the Mews lanes behind the backyards of houses. These were unpaved, undrained, uncontrolled, rubbish deposited, had to be removed by neighbours. The corporation in Derry refused to have anything to do with this. So this is, in Derry you can see a really close correlation between housing, the conditions and health. Dr. Abernethy, the hard-pressed medical superintendent of health in Derry, thought that 2/3 of Derry's houses have no bath, and in the Bogside area of the city there were no houses at all, he said, with a bath. And this is a good quote: there are very few public baths in the city, and, quote, local working class people bathe in the river in Derry, even though untreated sewage goes straight into the river. What saved the situation and made everything okay is that the river is tidal as far as the bank, and the sewage disappears rapidly. So, that was okay. Abernethy argued that tackling the housing problem would help to address the big problem of TB. Okay? And TB was the cause of almost half of all deaths in the 15 to 25 age group in Northern Ireland in 1931. It's a big problem. The provision of sanatorium in the region was also poor. Dental provision in Derry, for example, was also poor. For a school population of 9,000, there were 2 part-time dentists working 1 afternoon a week. It's not exactly high-quality dental care. All these things, all these pressures, lead eventually, in 1944, to the creation, after a big argument too, to the creation of the Ministry of Health and Local Government. Not everybody was satisfied. Lots of people wanted a separate Ministry of Health, but it wasn't thought appropriate for Northern Ireland, and the government decided to go for this Ministry of Health and Local Government, and that was described by a very dissatisfied Dr. William Lyle, Queen's University MP, as, and I quote, a mongrel sired by expediency out of necessity. So that was the Ministry of Health and Local Government. Finally, what difference does the war make? How are things different after the war? Well, it brought levels of economic activity not seen since partition. The economy had a hard time in the 20s and an even more difficult time for most of the 30s, so the war did bring some welcome respite from high levels of unemployment. And after the war, post-war unemployment was much lower, generally speaking, than it had been before the war. There's some narrowing of the gap between incomes between Northern Ireland and Great Britain. Still quite considerable, but it's narrowed as a result of the war. There was also a much greater and more determined effort to attract new industry into the region. I foretold, for example, an early arrival after the war. The pressures of the war brought health and social reform on a very extensive scale, which would have been inconceivable without conflict, including the National Health Service, of course, from 1940. The war led to more participation by women and young people in unionism, perhaps in politics more generally, but certainly within unionism. And there were, both of those groups were a progressive force in the party. At the same time, in the general elections of 1945, the Stormont elections, the Westminster elections, there's a big increase in the anti-unionist vote. But worries that the unionist government had about the new Labour government in Britain elected in 1945 proved, generally speaking, to be unfounded. The Labour government was much more supportive of unionism than anybody could have thought. Northern Ireland thought it would be able to capitalise on its role in the war and its role in the Battle of the Atlantic and so on in the United States after the war, but it couldn't, and it didn't, because it couldn't match Dublin or Irish America in the region. And this was one of the real disappointments for the unionist leadership, that the Americans just didn't seem to appreciate Northern Ireland's role in the war. And after 1945, the Anti-Partition League established, was very energetic in anti-Northern Ireland propaganda. It unsettles border unionists endlessly. So that's a big new player on the block after 1945 in Britain, in the United States, and elsewhere as well. So, all things considered, as a final comment here, I think the war and the immediate post-war period, when Eire became a republic, contributed to what Dennis Kennedy once called the widening gulf between the two islands. Thank you very much.